In the 1970s, across the parched inland basins, the water was disappearing. Inland rivers had dropped to dusty channels, regional fish stocks had collapsed, and state authorities executed what seemed like an undeniable act of mercy. They filled transport tankers with a small African fish and emptied them into the continent's largest artificial impoundments. 50 years later, up to 80% of the native fish in those catchments are gone. Nobody smuggled this species in. There was no overturned aquarium, no ballast dump, no unfortunate accident. It was policy, signed off, funded, and celebrated. And the fish they chose is sitting on dinner plates in millions of suburban homes tonight. Tilapia. This is the story of how a country tried to solve rural hardship and released a force it could never recall. I quote M. Ambrose White. On this channel, we trace ecological disasters back to the administrative paperwork that authorized them. And this one carries an official seal. The decision came out of regional water authorities, responsible for managing the dry interior. By 1971, bureaucrats faced a crisis engineering couldn't solve. They had spent decades pouring concrete across sun-baked catchments, constructing massive dams to hold water in a land where rain can vanish for years at a stretch. The reservoirs filled, but almost nothing lived in them. Native river species had evolved for unpredictable seasonal surges and moving channels. They suffered in warm, still, oxygen-deprived water sitting behind concrete walls. So, authorities imported Nile tilapia from West Africa and stocked them directly into public reservoirs. On paper, it was meticulous work. The fish were placed by trained biologists to feed regional communities with few other options. Within years, those impoundments produced record yields. Fishermen who had been pulling up empty nets were filling entire boats. The program expanded rapidly. What began in one catchment was repeated across neighboring systems, spreading through major inland river basins. By the 1990s, tilapia had been deliberately placed into storages across vast swaths of the country. Nobody involved was thinking about invasion biology. This was stocking a dam at a continental scale. The problem was the sheer adaptability of the creature they had just put in the water. Nile tilapia evolved in the rift lakes and ephemeral systems of East Africa, in some of the most unforgiving freshwater environments on Earth. Shallow basins, blistering heat, and millions of years of water bodies drying to muddy pools, turning brackish, going stagnant, and refilling again. Anything that couldn't handle that brutal cycle left no descendants. What survived is an animal with environmental tolerances that read like a typo. Tilapia stay active in water at 8 degrees Celsius and in water at 40. They keep feeding in oxygen levels so low that most native freshwater fish would already be floating belly up. They graze algae, aquatic vegetation, and organic detritus off the mud. They eat insect larvae, native crustaceans, and the eggs of competing species, switching between food sources instantly depending on whatever sits in front of them. Yet the mechanism that makes tilapia nearly impossible to eradicate isn't just a voracious appetite. It is how the female protects her brood. Most native freshwater species scatter their eggs across gravel riverbeds and swim away, leaving them vulnerable to predators and shifting currents. A female tilapia holds her fertilized eggs safely inside her mouth until they hatch. Even after hatching, she keeps the fry inside her mouth, releasing them briefly to feed and sucking them back in the second a shadow moves overhead. She doesn't eat for the entire period. The survival rate on a mouth-brooded clutch is astronomically higher than on eggs left in a sandbank, and she can repeat the entire cycle in roughly 4 weeks. Put that animal in a warm inland storage with no co-evolved apex predator, and the biological compound interest spirals out of control within 2 seasons. Then the commercial aquaculture sector took notice. By the 1980s, tilapia had transitioned from a drought relief initiative into a massive commercial industry. Global agriculture groups began calling it the aquatic chicken, a moniker reflecting its sheer feed conversion efficiency. Primary producers measure efficiency using feed conversion ratios, the weight of feed required to yield a kilogram of meat. Beef cattle sit somewhere between 6 and 10 to 1. Tilapia operates near 1.5 to 1, thriving on cheap, plant-based feed instead of expensive fish meal. Then, in 1988, a selective breeding program developed fast-growing strain lines that accelerated growth rates far beyond wild stocks. Those genetically selected lines rapidly spread through commercial hatcheries worldwide. Today, tilapia is one of the most cultivated fish on the planet, with millions of tons produced annually, and major inland operations farming them in floating net cages moored inside public storages. Operators choose these public reservoirs for a simple reason. The water is warm, the real estate costs nothing, and the river current sweeps the biological waste downstream for free. That final detail is where the entire system breaks down. A floating mesh cage isn't a sealed container. It is merely a fence suspended in a public river system. Enclosures tear under stress, mooring lines snap during sudden seasonal flash floods, and massive storages spill over their concrete walls during wet years, pouring thousands of captive fish straight into river channels that authorities never intended to stock. These impoundments don't exist in isolation. Primary river systems form vast, connected chains where each weir and dam feeds directly into the next catchment downstream. Once an invasive population takes hold in one storage, it gains an open highway to every reach below it. Escapes from cage aquaculture occur constantly, treated by commercial operators as an acceptable operational loss. The cumulative leakage across decades of commercial farming has been catastrophic. Once tilapia established themselves in a wild river system, three distinct ecological pressures hit simultaneously. The first is intense grazing competition. Tilapia work the riverbed relentlessly, stripping the biofilm, algae, and organic detritus that iconic native grazers depend on. Nothing looks dramatic on the surface. The native fish simply grow thinner, spawn less frequently, and produce fewer surviving young until local populations quietly stop replacing themselves. The second pressure is total structural destruction of spawning grounds. Male tilapia excavate large breeding nests in soft river mud, creating hundreds of crater-like depressions across the riverbed. That constant digging suspended heavy sediment in the water column, smothering rooted aquatic weeds and destroying the precise gravel substrate native species require to lay their eggs. The third mechanism is direct predation on native eggs and juvenile hatchlings, targeting even the young of apex predatory fish that might otherwise have kept tilapia numbers in check. Yet a fourth impact stems directly from the infrastructure rather than the fish. Industrial stocking cages concentrate thousands of hungry animals in a single location. Fecal matter and uneaten feed drop straight into open public waters, overloading the system with raw nitrogen and phosphorus. This nutrient spike triggers massive toxic blue-green algal blooms. When those blooms inevitably die off and decompose, the process strips dissolved oxygen out of the water column, creating massive dead zones where native fish suffocated by the thousands. Tilapia, equipped with their extreme physiological tolerances, simply gulp air at the surface and survive intact. Combine those four ecological pressures, and you end up with shocking numbers. Environmental surveys across heavily infested river systems reveal that tilapia now make up the overwhelming majority of total fish biomass, reducing native species to a tiny fraction of their historic numbers. Pause for a second and think. When did you last buy a cheap white fish fillet at the local supermarket? Because it is remarkably likely that fish came directly from a floating net cage in one of these compromised catchments. There is no personal blame in that. Consumer demand is simply what put those cages in the water. For decades, land managers treated this as an isolated freshwater problem, believing a natural physiological boundary guarded our coastal ecosystems. Osmoregulation usually keeps freshwater invaders where they are. A freshwater fish is saltier than its surrounding environment, spending its life pumping excess water out of its cells. Marine species face the inverse challenge. Shift either into the other's environment, and cellular failure quickly follows. That biological wall is why invasive freshwater pests rarely reach the ocean. But tilapia are actively breaking through it. The critical detail most commentary overlooks is that two distinct species are involved. The fish raised in commercial aquaculture cages is primarily Nile tilapia, which tolerates brackish water but struggles in full ocean salinity. The fish expanding through coastal estuaries, tidal creeks, and mangrove channels is largely Mozambique tilapia, an earlier introduction with a far higher salt tolerance, capable of thriving in full ocean salinity and hypersaline conditions. Two distinct invaders sharing one common name, creating a public debate that repeatedly blurs them into a single threat. This distinction should deeply concern anyone watching our coastal fisheries. Estuaries and coastal mangroves serve as critical nurseries for the entire marine ecosystem. Commercial prawns, mud crabs, and prized wild fish species rely on these sheltered brackish reaches to spawn and raise juvenile stock away from large oceanic predators. Introducing an adaptable pest that devours eggs and fry, thrives in high salinity, and breeds every single month creates a massive threat inside the exact habitat designed to protect young life. It is an ecological front line that no regulatory framework was monitoring for a freshwater invader. If you want more investigations like this, hit subscribe. While regional water boards were building this industry locally, the exact same fish was executing the exact same invasion across 4 other continents. Nile tilapia has been introduced into well over 100 countries outside its original African range, making it one of the most widely transplanted freshwater species on Earth. In tropical Central America, vast lake systems have hosted commercial cage farming for decades, while native fish populations that regional communities relied on for generations have plummeted over the same period. In Queensland, tilapia are classified as a noxious, high-priority pest species. Possessing one, alive or dead, is strictly illegal, and using one for fishing bait incurs severe biosecurity fines. When an established population is detected in a Queensland waterway, biosecurity officers have resorted to dosing entire isolated reaches with chemical fish toxicants like rotenone, simply because conventional netting cannot keep pace with an animal that reproduces every 4 weeks. In North American canal networks, they have occupied waterways since the 1960s, becoming a permanent feature of the aquatic landscape. So what actually solves a problem of this magnitude? Total eradication is entirely off the table. Biosecurity agencies have never successfully cleared an established tilapia population out of a major open river system, and the practical argument against attempting it is formidable. This fish supplies cheap, vital protein to millions of households operating on tight budgets. It produces that protein at a vastly lower land, water, and carbon cost than traditional livestock raised on pastoral land. The animal didn't invade on its own initiative. Every single step in this environmental disaster was authorized by an official sitting behind a desk with an operational budget to meet. Real solutions require genuine structural innovation, and 2 main pathways show real promise. The first focuses on biological containment, producing commercial stock completely incapable of reproducing in the wild. Industry hatcheries are deploying advanced genetic techniques to produce all-male supermale lines, while triploid induction, which alters chromosome counts to render fish completely sterile, is becoming standard practice across global aquaculture. A sterile fish that escapes into a river lives out its natural lifespan without founding a new invasive colony. The second pathway involves moving farming operations completely out of natural waterways into closed, land-based systems. Recirculating aquaculture technology and biofloc systems cultivate fish in fully enclosed indoor tanks, recycling over 90% of their water while treating biological waste on site. Nothing escapes from a shed full of concrete tanks, and zero nutrient pollution leaks into public catchments. But land-based systems cost significantly more capital to construct and operate than floating a net cage inside a state-owned reservoir that taxpayers funded. That capital cost is the ultimate barrier. Open net cages remain cheap for producers simply because the environmental cost of the waste and biological leakage is transferred directly onto the public river system rather than appearing on the corporate balance sheet. Which brings us to the core dilemma facing modern environmental management. Governments made a logical, highly defensible decision back in 1971. Spend public funds to mitigate severe drought and provide immediate food security for struggling rural families. The true bill arrived 50 years later, denominated in ecological degradation that no government department had factored into its balance sheet. Do you enforce strict biosecurity mandates on an industry supplying affordable seafood to millions of consumers, inevitably driving up supermarket prices during a cost of living squeeze? Or do you accept degraded river systems, toxic algal blooms, and declining native species as the unavoidable cost of cheap protein? The answer isn't simple, and it certainly changes whether you are managing a dry inland basin or stocking a modern aquaculture plant. The fish simply adapted to the conditions we provided. Human economic policy laid the groundwork for the disaster. I'm Ambrose White. If you want more deep dives into ecological crises that started with an official stamp on a government document, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next investigation.